In 1602, the English playwright William Shakespeare wrote a play entitled Othello. The main character, Othello, was a Moorish ambassador who became a general in the Venetian army. And Othello was a regal character that, it's a complicated story, but in from 1603 up until the early 1800s, the play was typically the character Othello was played by whites in blackface. In in the early 1800s, a black actor from New York who actually went to England, and he became a performer in the play Othello and played the main character, Ira Aldridge, made the role of Othello a very regal role and one that instilled Black pride in the Black population, in the Black community, because it depicted a Black in royalty. And in 1902, the role of Othello was played by a Sudanese Egyptian known as Deuce Muhammad Ali. Deuce Muhammad Ali was also a Pan-Africanist, and he was a person who was conscious as an activist in working to elevate the consciousness of Black people worldwide. And after playing this role of Othello, he came in contact with Marcus Garvey, who was a student in London at the time. And he became friends with Marcus Garvey, and he became somewhat of a mentor for Marcus Garvey and had a profound impact on Marcus Garvey. And he also authored, he had a journal, a paper, and Marcus Garvey wrote a couple of articles for him in his newspaper. And subsequently, Deuce Muhammad traveled to the United States and was a writer for Marcus Garvey's newspaper, Negro World. And Deuce Muhammad was probably the first person to come into the African American community and to have a significant impact in terms of exposing the Black community to the teachings of Islam and the religion of Islam since the time of slavery. And Deuce Muhammad also taught a lot of information about the Moors. And by playing the role of Othello, it became impressed upon the minds of many in the Black community, that many Black people in America are descendants of Moors. And so this idea began to take form, and a student of Marcus Garvey, Noble Drew Ali, actually formed something called the Moorish Science Temple of America. And he used certain evidence about the Moors and certain contexts where certain Black people were historically referred to as Moors in various parts of the world, and developed something called the Moorish Science Temple. It also was significant that in about 1912, Henry Ossawa Tanner, who was a famous African-American painter, painted a painting called Gateway to Tangier. Tangier, of course, being in Morocco. And he did this famous painting that's depicted here on the bottom left part of the screen, to show that it actually was a gateway into Tangier, um, and he actually made several versions of this painting. He was very fascinated with this this situation where he traveled to Morocco on four separate occasions, and he also lived in Paris. And but I think it was very significant that this was part of a consciousness and awakening for him, um, even as a painter. And but by painting this powerful painting, it became a gateway of consciousness for many African Americans, who then began to look through the image of of this painting and through the renderings of the character Othello, and to begin to expand their consciousness and begin to look at things from an international perspective, and to begin to look at what was going on in Africa and what was going on in other parts of the world with the Black diaspora. And this expansion in consciousness began to permeate and expand across the United States. And this also was occurring at a time when W.E.B. Du Bois, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, was involved in organizing 5 Pan-African Congresses, first one in 1900. Through the 1940s, he was involved in organizing 5 separate Pan-African Congresses where Black students from all over the world, different parts of the world, would come together. The first one was held in Manchester, England. And they began to start talking about the concept of Pan-Africanism in the unification of Black people worldwide, in building communities of Black people that interconnected with each other in terms of consciousness, in terms of trade, in terms of business, in terms of cultural exchange, in terms of education, etc., so that the heritage of Black people would come together, and Blacks in the diaspora would have a place of central organization, and the Black community worldwide could advocate for the unification and liberation of Africa. And after these 5 Pan-African Congresses, the Ghana under Dr. Kwame Nkrumah became an independent post-colonial African country. And then you had over 54 African countries emerge and gain their independence over years following that. And so when we look at the status of Africa now in terms of African unity, the organization of African countries beginning to come together and have mutual cooperation and working together, and many still having relationships with their former colonial rulers, such as England and the various parts of Europe, the Netherlands and the French, all of these colonial powers that held parts of Africa after the so-called Berlin Conference in 1884, that Blacks began to reclaim their own destiny and to organize and liberate their countries. And so you saw a rise in independence in terms of Black communities. And so this is still an ongoing process. And part of the key of this is the gradual exposure of the Black community to its own history and culture, so that Black people began to learn about their history and understand what happened in the past, what happened to Africa, and how Africa was subjugated and destroyed and experienced the Holocaust. And Black people were scattered around the world in the so-called African diaspora. And so you have Black people who came from certain parts of Africa. They came from common places, but they were spread out. Some went to Brazil. Some went to Costa Rica, Nicaragua, or Mexico. Some went to the Caribbean. Some went to North America. And so you have Black people who were dispersed throughout the world, and they may speak English, or they may speak French, or they may speak Spanish, or they may speak Dutch or Portuguese, but they all have a common origin, and they inherited these languages from their colonial masters that took them into captivity and denied them the opportunity to speak their own languages or to explore and develop their own culture or learn their own culture or practice their own ways of life. And so many of these people throughout the world are now beginning to gain a consciousness of what happened to them historically and to begin to recognize what they have in common with Black people throughout the diaspora and Africa. And so there's a movement of Black people coming together all over the world to build unity and to build connections with each other. And Deuce Muhammad had a profound impact upon Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey brought a program to the United States, of course, that was opposed by J. Edgar Hoover, who worked to destroy him from the FBI. Marcus Garvey developed the Universal Negro Improvement Association and called for the unification of Black people worldwide. He said that there are 400 million Black people at that time around the world that have, it says that we will create a universal confraternity of Africans for the African at home and abroad. And he attempted to develop a system of ships called the Black Star Line to begin trade relations so that there would be ships owned by Black people that could travel between Black communities around the globe and to promote trade and economic development in Black communities in Africa as well as in the African diaspora. And so this vision that Marcus Garvey brought, that, he said, we have a glorious history and we shall create another in the future that will astonish the world. And much of this information he learned by studying and being mentored by Deuce Muhammad, who's a Sudanese Egyptian, a Black man who's educated in England and who brought a significant consciousness forward that had a profound impact upon Marcus Garvey. And so I'm sharing some of these things so that we can begin to look at, and when we examine critical race, the issue of African American consciousness and how African American consciousness has begun to grow and expand. And there's a lot of pieces to it that we have to add in terms of our discussion. Like, for example, if you look at the Christian community, the so-called Coptic Christians in Egypt, and then if you look further east into Ethiopia and in the region of East Africa, Zania, what you find is that there were a number of Black Christian empires that functioned based on the religion of Christianity and practiced their own version of Christianity and even some Judaism before Islam came to Africa or was even invented. And so in terms of looking at how all of these things play into the consciousness of Black people and being able to begin to understand our history and put our history together piece by piece, Dr. Ivan van Sertima, who was a brilliant scholar, who also wrote a book called The Golden Age of the Moors, spoke about Professor Cheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese physicist, linguist, anthropologist, and mathematician, and he said that Africa is like a shattered diamond, and it is pieces of it are strewn all around the world, and they're in private collections and museums all over the world. The history of Africa, and this history has yet to be brought together into a single consciousness. And so um, part of this discussion is to try to begin the process of our recognizing the need to begin to research and go back and understand this history. Some of this is history they're not going to teach you in the regular public education system. And some of this information you may get in some colleges or bits and pieces of it in some colleges and universities, at graduate level courses or even in a few undergraduate courses. But this is research worthy information, and I challenge you to begin to research this. Find out who Ira Aldridge, who he was and what he did, what he achieved. Who is Deuce Muhammad, and what was his role and what did he do? Who is Marcus Garvey? What was his role and what did he do? Who is Noble Drew Ali? What was his role and what did he do? And who was Henry O. Tanner? And who was he? What did he do? And began to look at and began to build a consciousness and understanding of these historical characters who bring together bits and pieces of critical information that have an impact on the expansion of consciousness of the African American community and the African community worldwide.